Probably the most famous figure in the church of the 20th century would be Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's probably a name that most of us have come across at some point. Bonhoeffer's greatest theological contribution to the church, I think at least, was placing once again at its centre this idea of discipleship, that the Christian church is not supposed to be merely a people who give their assent to some intellectual proposition about God, or who seek for some inner spiritual religious experience. Bonhoeffer insisted that at the heart of being a Christian is actually following Jesus. It has something to do with the way we live our lives, where we place our bodies in the world. I suspect, though, that Bonhoeffer is actually most famous, though, for his part in the plot against the life of Hitler. I suspect that when anyone anywhere in the world gives a talk on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, even if it's about something much more academic about what he was writing, someone ends up bringing up his role in the plot against Hitler. It's probably what he's best known for. What's little known, I think less known about that, is how great a role his own family had in bringing him into this role he had in the plot against Hitler's life. In 1939, just as war was breaking out, as Hitler was invading Poland, Bonhoeffer was confronted by his brother Klaus and his sister-in-law Emmy, who had already been involved in the conspiracy against Hitler for quite some time. Neither Klaus nor Emmy were Christians, and they were worried that Bonhoeffer's emphasis on the discipleship, the following of Jesus, the living out the Sermon on the Mount that we heard from in the reading that Kevin read to us earlier, they were concerned that this might make Bonhoeffer a bit squeamish, a bit reluctant to be involved in something that might be a bit messy, a bit dirty, this plot against Hitler. And at one point, Bonhoeffer's biographer recalls Emmy, his sister-in-law, confronts him and says, "You Christians, you know what needs to be done, and you are relieved when someone else does it. But you are, for some reason, unwilling to get your hands dirty yourselves." I think this is maybe one of the deepest and most challenging criticisms that can be made of the way of discipleship that we talk about so often in our churches. The way of following Jesus, taking up our cross, living out the Sermon on the Mount, not just talking about it as some values to remind us about how fallen we are and how sinful we are and so on, but actually something that we're supposed to embody. Maybe it might be thought that this whole way of discipleship is just not that suitable for a world with people like Hitler in it. It's not suitable for a world where there is so much radical evil. And of course, the world in which we live in today is no less evil than the world in which Dietrich Bonhoeffer lived. You can think of many cases in the world in which we live of extreme and radical forms of evil. Probably the kind that gets the most press for us in Australia is what we hear about ISIS. And sure, it's true that this provides a great opportunity for what seems to be an increasingly racist press to create fear in us about Islam and people from Middle Eastern backgrounds and Arabic backgrounds. But that shouldn't stop us from recognizing that so much of what ISIS is engaged in is completely and utterly evil. The way in which women and gay and lesbian people are treated, and the perversion of the Islamic concept of jihad, which at its heart is just supposed to mean struggle, zealousness for the righteousness of God. In fact, a friend of a few of ours named Dave Andrews has an exciting new book coming out, if anyone wants to look out for it, called The Jihad of Jesus, where he's trying to explore the relationship between the idea of struggle for the righteousness of God in Islam and the way of discipleship that Jesus proclaims. So that's one example. Maybe North Korea is probably another example. How can we imagine the Sermon on the Mount speaking into, some way of responding to the evil that is perpetrated in North Korea? Perhaps a third example just this week, that dreadful shooting that took place in the church at Charleston in the United States, where 9 African American people were shot by a white man who had racist motivations in doing so. How can we make sense of the way of discipleship in this kind of context? I think what I want to try and do tonight is suggest some way that we could respond to Bonhoeffer's sister-in-law, some way in which we can give an account of the gospel, of the Christian gospel, that speaks into a world that is messy, a world where there is radical evil. Some way we can show that the gospel is not just this idealistic notion that is supposed to assume that everyone is cooperative and everyone is more or less good. I want to see if we can explore how the gospel is supposed to speak into just a world like the world in which we find ourselves. To help make things a bit clearer for us, I want to try and distinguish 3 different versions of this challenge, and I want to try and respond to each of them separately. The first one is that the whole story of the gospel seems to presume a kind of idealistic world, that the whole story that we have to tell is a story that does not allow for any evil in the world. We might call this the evangelism challenge, which challenges the story that we have to tell, that we just don't have a story that can speak to a world full of evil. A second way of looking at the challenge is that the way of discipleship that we find in our scriptures, in the gospel, is not something that it is advisable or that it is morally wise even for individuals to try and put into practice. So we might call this the moral challenge. The third challenge we might call the political challenge, which says even if the way of discipleship is suitable for individuals, it's suitable for you and me and for people, it's not suitable for institutions, it's not suitable at a political level. So there are these 3 challenges: the evangelism challenge, the moral challenge, and the political challenge. I want to try and respond to each of those respectively. So let's start with the evangelism challenge. I think the way this particular challenge is supposed to work is that it assumes that the story of Jesus is very similar to something like the story of Socrates, that Greek philosopher. It paints Jesus as someone who is primarily a moral teacher, who is trying to inquire into what is good and what is evil and what is virtue and what is vice. And that Jesus' death, like the death of Socrates, is the result of a tragic and unfortunate misunderstanding. It was an unfortunate accident. It wasn't supposed to happen. There was nothing about Jesus' life that necessitated or brought about his death. I think people actually quite often think about Jesus in this kind of way. They will say that the main reason we should be Christians, basically, is that Jesus' teachings, Jesus' ethics are better than Socrates' ethics. That Jesus' ethics are better than Buddha's ethics, and so on. And that's the reason we should be Christians. I think we often hear Jesus portrayed in this kind of way. But when we actually take time to read the Gospels, we find this is obviously not the case. For starters, the Gospels make it very clear to us that Jesus comes into a world that is messy. Jesus is, after all, born in a stable, a manger, where there is no room for him in the inn. We're straight away introduced to the radical inequality and injustice that exists in Jesus' time. And of course, in Matthew's Gospel, we hear this horrifying story about how when Herod, the Roman puppet king, finds out about Jesus, and he gives orders for all the young baby boys in Jerusalem to be killed. So straight away, at the very start of Matthew's Gospel, we're introduced to the reality of evil. We're not given any sense that this is a world that is sugar-coated, a world that is idealistic. Jesus comes into a world full of evil. Another thing that clearly, I think, distinguishes Jesus from Socrates is that Jesus is not simply philosophizing about what is good or evil, or what is virtue and what is vice in the world. Jesus engages himself in a whole ministry that is trying to change the world, that wants to herald a new reality, a new world that he calls the kingdom of God, or the reign of God. Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and all the Greek philosophical tradition that followed never expected really anything that they wrote or anything that they thought to actually come into being. They weren't really engaged in any way trying to change the world. But this is something that very clearly distinguishes Jesus from them. And this is what we find in the Sermon on the Mount, that these are not abstract teachings of virtue and vice. These are ways of trying to deal with the reality of evil. To say when someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn your other cheek instead, that obviously assumes that people are being struck. Otherwise, there would be no need for that teaching. This is a teaching that is designed for a world full of violence. You might wonder, though, the gospel is not just a story of evil, though. It's also a story of joy. It's a story of God's triumph over evil. And maybe we might hear a response from the evangelism challenge advocate who says, well, sure, okay, there are accounts of evil that factored into the Christian gospel, but the way the story ends with Jesus' resurrection and the forecast of God's triumph over evil, isn't this just too naive a story to take evil really seriously? There is something about the Uniting Church's tradition in particular that I think has a very good response to this. Our basis of union, the founding document that was penned at the time that the Uniting Church was formed, has this great expression where it says that the church is a church that exists between the times. It's a church that exists between the time of Christ's resurrection and the time when Christ will oversee the full consummation of all things into the complete and full unveiling of God's justice, of God's reign on earth. So the story that we have to offer is informed by this kind of ethic. The Sermon on the Mount is a story for a church in between the times, a story where evil persists in the world, and we don't assume that it's about to end tomorrow. Or you might think of the Romans passage that we heard from, which speaks of creation groaning like the labor pains of childbirth. Creation longs for release from the bondage of evil that it finds itself in. So I think this is probably the best way that we can respond to the evangelism challenge, is to say that on the one hand, our story deals directly with the reality of evil. And on the other hand, it does certainly stress the importance of joy and God's triumph over evil. But it reminds us that evil persists nonetheless, and that we are a people in between the times, trying to work out how to be disciples of Jesus in between this time where Christ has risen and Christ will bring all things together for good. So we might say, okay, the evangelism challenge is a bit mistaken. But what about the moral challenge then? Even if we say that the story of the gospel is written, it's designed for a world that is full of evil, we might say, well, that the way of discipleship that it offers us is just not a good way. It's just not a good way for dealing with an evil world, even if it's designed for that. So this is what the moral challenge might say, that the way of discipleship just doesn't work. I think the first thing that we should probably flag here is that as the church, we should be a little bit suspicious about people saying that things are a bad idea because they don't work. Often that's a really good way, I think, of sweeping under the rug what the real issue is, what's really going on and what's really important. I think a really good example of this is what we find going on in our own political news at the moment, with our current Prime Minister repeating in an almost liturgical fashion that the policy of stopping the boats has worked. And in a sense, this may well be true. It's accomplished what it set out to do. But that doesn't really address the question of the merits of the policy, does it? I mean, as one friend of ours, Jared McKenna, put it, that saying we should be happy because the boats have stopped is sort of like saying we should be happy that people have stopped jumping out of the windows of a burning building because we've boarded up the windows. If we actually reflect on the purpose of the policy, the purpose of what we're talking about doing here, then we can maybe see beyond this whole conundrum of what works and what doesn't. So I think this is something that Christians should learn to be particularly good at, because Jesus does this sort of thing right through the Gospels. I mean, think of the way Jesus teaches about the Sabbath and questions what the Sabbath is for. Sure, he says, you have this whole institution of rules and principles that works after a fashion. But Jesus says, actually, no, that's not the purpose of the Sabbath. The whole purpose of the Sabbath is to actually be an aid to humanity. It's to help realize God's justice in the world and bring people into right relationship with God and all creation. The Sabbath is made for humanity, says Jesus, not humanity for the Sabbath. So this is the first thing I think we should say to the moral challenge, that we should be wary and suspicious of anyone who says that the way of discipleship doesn't work. Maybe, though, that doesn't really settle things. We might think of some scenarios where the way of discipleship, it seems, really doesn't work because there are some ends or some things that we want to happen that it's really just not good at helping to happen. An example that I remember one of my uncles used to say around the time of the Port Arthur massacre in Tasmania. He used to say, well, what you really want to be the case then is that there's just some bystander who happens to have a gun with him and is a good shot. Maybe in light of what the shooting that happened in Charleston this week, you could hear that same challenge being pressed to us. Don't you wish there was someone present who was willing to put the Sermon on the Mount to one side and just happened to have a gun with them and was an accurate shot? This is definitely something that we have to acknowledge the attractiveness of. It's persuasive force. I think if we completely deny this and put it to one side, then we are being unrealistic and we're disconnecting ourselves from our human condition, which is to want to see people's lives saved. At the same time, though, I don't think we can discard the Sermon on the Mount. I don't think we can really, in any convenient way, put non-violence to one side. The reading that Kevin read for us, the bits about non-violence, come at the end of 6 repeated stanzas of, "You have heard this, but now I tell you this." It's spiraling towards a climax of what is at the heart of Jesus' teaching. So as one commentator has put it, we should probably say plainly that if we don't think it's possible for us to love our enemies, then we should be more honest and say we don't think Jesus can be the Messiah. It may be quite an honest response for us to say we just don't like what the text says here. I think there's maybe something a bit admirable about that, to say that, well, we just can't bring ourselves to agree with what the scripture says. But the problem with this, I think, is that it seems to license our opponents to do the same, right? Everyone who wants to say that the gospel doesn't really have that much to say about injustice and about poverty and about the oppression and so on, that just seems to license them a bit more to say, well, we don't really like that stuff either. So the more we are willing to disconnect ourselves from the text, the more license we give for others to do the same, and the more we become a people who don't really have a story to tell that is different from what we see around us. I think, though, part of the problem here is that we understand things like the Sermon on the Mount in a legalistic fashion, in a very Pharisaical kind of fashion. We think that the Sermon on the Mount is just another list of rules and regulations that we are supposed to follow unflinchingly. I don't think that's what's really going on there. I think it's more supposed to be a series of illustrations of creative responses for how Christians can try and find an alternative to the way of violence and the way of surrender. I mean, that's another one of those dichotomies, right, that is repeatedly offered to the world. If anyone watches Fox News, you hear this repeatedly, that any willingness to refuse to take violent responses to terrorism is the same as surrender. I mean, part of any Christian faithfulness to the gospel has got to be to try and explode this whole dichotomy and say, no, that's not all there is. That's not all there is. So I think that's the best way we can try and understand the Sermon on the Mount. And I think this is perhaps the best way we can respond to the moral challenge, is to say that the way of discipleship is not supposed to be about another long list of rules. Thou shalt and thou shalt not, thou shalt not, etc. It's supposed to be a way of saying, here are some illustrations about how you can faithfully follow Jesus in a world that is so violent. What if we say, though, that, okay, the way of discipleship might be okay for individuals to follow in certain places, but it doesn't work for political institutions. It doesn't work for the larger group. This is the political objection, the political challenge. The first thing we should probably say here is that we're all doing politics. We are all part of political institutions. All politics really is. The moment we start talking, the moment we start talking about what we should do, where the we is more than one of us, we are doing some kind of politics. The moment we start talking not just about what I should do, but what we should do, we are talking about politics. So this is why we say the church is itself a politics. That any community, any institution, no matter how big or small, is a politics. Whenever we are talking about what we should do, we are talking about a politics. And I think something that the gospel doesn't allow us to do is to say that the Sermon on the Mount and the way of discipleship is only for individuals. Matthew's gospel, after all, ends with this great commission where Jesus gathers the disciples and says, "This gospel is for all the world, and I am charging you with responsibility to share this with all the world and teach them everything that I have taught you." And at the climax of those teachings that Jesus offered was this commandment to love your enemies. So this isn't something that just individuals are supposed to do. It's not even something that just Christians are supposed to do, as if Christians could be satisfied with saying, well, we're loving our enemies and that's all that matters. We are supposed not just to be a people of peace, but to herald a world of peace that breaks into a world of violence. So it certainly won't do for us to say that the way of discipleship is okay for us at an individual level, or even just at a local, small community level, that this way of discipleship is supposed to have something to do with the whole world. It's supposed to provide a way for the whole world to be a human community. Though I think the advocate of the political challenge might respond to this and say, okay, that's all well and good, but that doesn't really take into account something that's very distinctive about political institutions. That when people gather together, something changes when they start talking about we rather than just I. They have power, they have influence, and they find themselves caught up in some inevitable kind of violence, whether they like it or not. Political institutions are by their very nature some kind of exercise of power. So for us to talk about the Sermon on the Mount, this way of non-violence, the way of discipleship is taking up our cross, it can't really seem to be applied to institutions that are by their very nature about the exercise of power. One possible way of responding to this is to say, well, as Christians, we should evacuate political institutions as quickly as possible. We should avoid, like the plague, any kind of political institution that seems to be engaged in any kind of exercise of power. I don't think this is a completely crazy response. I think probably in some circumstances there are plenty of institutions in the world that Christians would be better off leaving and avoiding, shunning as much as possible. But at the same time, even if this was possible for us to do, I don't think it would be necessarily a wise thing for us to do. And part of why I think this is that in a lot of cases, these are institutions that have been set up by Christians. These are institutions that have been set up by the church. So I feel like, I don't know about you, but I feel like it would be a bit disingenuous of us to say, now we're going to have nothing to do with these institutions that we are, because they're all corrupted, and let's just conveniently forget about the fact that the church has set them up in the first place and probably bears some responsibility for the way in which they've become corrupted. So my feeling is that this response is a bit disingenuous. So I want to suggest a different way that we as Christians can try and engage with political institutions. One where we say, rather than try and give up as quickly as possible whatever power we have, let's acknowledge that the church as a political institution has power. and that Christian people in various places and other institutions and positions have power. And the way they should exercise this power is by trying to use what privilege, what status they have to advocate for those who have no such status, to advocate for those who are denied all the privileges that we receive. It's sort of, you could almost think of it as a kind of liberation theology from above. It would be odd for us to read the great texts of people who have worked amongst the poor and the broken and say, we're like that. We are the church of the broken and the marginalized and the poor. Because that would be, to some extent, a falsehood. Because we are not simply a church of the poor and marginalized. We are a church that is still, even in Australia today, accorded a great deal of power and influence. So maybe what we can learn from many of those teachers, many of those scholars, many of those people is to say, we should become a church that uses the position that we have to advocate for those who are marginalized. I want to briefly make a couple of points about how this might affect the kind of church we are. One is that it seems to mean that we have to become a listening community, that we can't advocate for the marginalized if we are not first listening for them. The Romans reading that we heard this evening gives us a picture of the groans of an oppressed world as being the cry of the Spirit of God. That if we want to be a church that listens for the voice of God, then we also have to be a church that listens for the voice of the marginalized. So that's one remark. I think another remark I want to make is that we have to be open and honest about the kind of privileges that we have. We can't deny them. We can't pretend that we're something that we're not. But we can still try and exercise them in some kind of godly fashion, perhaps. An example that comes to mind is one of the earliest, I think, criticisms or more sort of sarcastic comments that I heard made about the movement that is currently going on, Love Makes a Way, to try and bring about a change in our government's policy towards asylum seekers. I remember someone once remarking, there's a lot of white privilege in there. But I remember someone saying in response, well, yeah, that's true, but I can't think of a better thing to do with my white privilege than to advocate for those who are marginalized. So I think this is maybe a better way of us engaging with institutions. A last remark I want to make on this is that even in this model, we can still try and find ways to avoid or at least minimize those more blatant and overt forms of violence. That even being part of powerful institutions and even finding ourselves invariably tangled up in systems of violence, there are still things we can do to try and make them less violent. One of the first maxims that I ever heard from this community and from our Bible study group at Sydney University was to never let what you can't do stop you from doing what you can do. Never let what you can't do stop you from doing what you can do. And I think this maybe helps us to find maybe a helpful way of acknowledging the power systems and the systems of violence that we are a part of, without being unrealistic and hopelessly defeatist about what we are capable of. So I hope some of this makes sense to you, and it might help if you ever found yourself asking the same questions that Dietrich Bonhoeffer's sister-in-law Emmy was asking of him. It might help you to find a way of seeing how the way of discipleship is not hopelessly naive. It's not something that assumes a world where there is no evil. It's not a way of discipleship that makes no sense for us to practice, and it's not a way of discipleship that has nothing to say to political institutions either. I want to finish by addressing one final thought or problem that we might have with all of this. We as Christians make a regular habit of confessing our sins. At least if we have a good worship service, then we are going to make sure that at some point there is a prayer of confession where we have to say that we have sinned and stand in need of God's forgiveness. We are not always going to follow this way of discipleship. And we are going to find ourselves tangled in webs of violence and departing from the way of discipleship from time to time, even when we do our best not to. And I wonder if this is one of the biggest sources of people giving up on following Jesus. I wonder if this is one of the things that leaves us so brokenhearted that we think we can't go on following Jesus. Because we've talked about this grand way of discipleship, and then we look at our own lives and we see that everything that we're talking about, everything that we're preaching, is not really mirrored that well in the way that we live. And we might find that we end up something like the wild demon-possessed man in Mark's Gospel who says, "My name is Legion." We go insane because we just can't stomach it anymore. We can't manage to keep going when we see the massive contradictions in our lives. The contradictions between what we preach, the way we want to follow Jesus, and how we end up living. I want to address this because I think this is something that is really at the heart of all that we say about evil. This is just another way, I think, that the problem of evil internalizes itself in our own lives and tries to break each and every one of you, is to make us end up believing that we are so caught up in evil ourselves that there is nothing redemptive in our own person. And we end up in some kind of deep self-loathing, some kind of self-hatred. I wonder if a lot of the time in our churches, when we talk about conversion to Jesus and turning towards Jesus with our whole selves and following Jesus, we idealize this. I think we sometimes talk about turning towards Jesus as if at that moment it is now as if all our desires and our impulses and our lives will be transformed like that, and that everything that was messed up and wicked and deplorable about our old selves and our desires will be gone, and we won't have to worry about that anymore. And then we look at ourselves and say, hang on, I'm still this person who has these really violent impulses. I still find myself thinking these really sexist and racist thoughts, but I thought this wasn't supposed to happen anymore now that I'm following Jesus. Something can't be right. I think that at the heart of this, we need to remember at a very personal level that great maxim that our own church tells us, that we are a people in between the times. That this applies to us at a personal, devotional level as well. Perhaps the way we should think of the wholeness that Jesus Christ brings into our lives is not as if every aspect of your person is instantly transfigured into something that is now perfect and Christ-like. Perhaps we should think of ourselves as just as broken and just as messed up as we once were, but with the one difference that makes all the difference, that we can now recognize that God is present with us, that God is present with us in our brokenness, that God is holding the broken parts of our lives together That God is present with us at the deepest and most dark parts of our lives when we feel like we have strayed irredeemably from the path of discipleship. I think this is that wonderful message that the Romans reading we heard offers us tonight. That there is no depth to which we can sink, where we can escape the love of God. We can depart from the way of discipleship, but we cannot depart from God. God sticks with us. That God is present even in those moments when we look at ourselves and can't figure out how there is anything in the teachings of Jesus that seems to be mirrored in our own lives, and we feel that despair and pain and dreadful self-loathing. The gospel tells us that God is present with us. God is holding us together, even at those moments, and especially at those moments. And so that's what I want to encourage you most of all tonight, to hold together. In your own discipleship, in your own efforts to follow Jesus, remember that God is present with you when you are being faithful, and even when you find yourself stepping away from the path of faithfulness. God is still present with you. God is still holding you together. Amen.
Amen.